The words with which the fourth gospel open, "In the beginning was the Word," are profoundly true in relation certainly to human life. I don't think we can't say that they're true in relation to the beginning of the universe, but they are unquestionably true in relation to the beginning of humanity and human civilization. It was the invention of language by our remote ancestors which finally distinguished man from the brutes. And the ways in which human behavior differs from animal behavior are to an enormous extent conditioned by the fact that man has a conceptual language. The language of animals, of course, is merely a series of noises, emotionally conditioned noises about events taking place here and now. They have no conceptual terms, and they can't, they have no words which indicate classes of things or the general resemblance of things. And this means that they can't think in generalities, they can't think at all successfully about the past or the future, or about events which are remote from them in space as well as in time. A very interesting example of this was provided by the great German ethologist Köhler, whose apes, he found, were perfectly capable, if a banana was hung out of their reach and a stick was set before them, they were perfectly capable of picking up the stick and knocking the banana down. But if the banana was placed in front of them and the stick was placed behind them, they couldn't do this because they had to see both the things at once in order to be able to do this thing. We have, of course, a name banana and a name stick, and therefore we can hold these two things in our mind simultaneously, even when they are not simultaneously present to our senses. The ape, which lacks these symbolic concepts for the objects in question, cannot do this, so that we see this extraordinarily intelligent animal limited in this absurd way. I mean, it seems absolutely incredible that a creature as intelligent as a chimpanzee should be so ridiculously limited as it is through this lack of language. And of course it is precisely the existence of language which makes the enormous qualitative difference between human and animal behavior. Human behavior is to a large extent consistent and continuous. I mean, it can be. We can go on pursuing a single goal for months or years together. This is simply because we have formulated ideals, we have formulated principles, we have this pattern of language which acts as a sort of set of tracks along which we can run. The animal does not have anything of the kind, and consequently its behavior is extraordinarily intermittent. It's very curious, for example, to observe two cats fighting. They will spar up against one another and spit and scratch, and then suddenly one will stop and lift a hind leg and start licking itself, and the other will scratch and turn around. Then they will begin fighting again. And this, of course, among human beings would be impossible, because each opponent would have in his head, this devil is out to kill me, he belongs to an inferior race, and I must suppress him in one way or another. And we have then, this language gives us this capacity to be consistent, both for good and for evil in our behavior. I mean, in this context, we can say that language is a device for making it possible for human beings to do in cold blood what animals can do only in the heat of passion, either positive passion of affection or love, or else in the negative passions of hatred and dislike. Whereas we, because of language, can go on behaving either, as I say, in the most extremely intelligent and even angelic way, or else in an incredibly stupid and diabolic way, of which animals, both of which ways of behaving, animals are completely incapable. This, I think, is an extraordinarily important point, that we have this capacity for behaving much better and much more intelligently than animals, but also behaving much worse and much more stupidly than animals. I mean, no animal would be capable of the prolonged diabolism of people inspired by some hideous negative ideal which permits them to go on behaving abominably over years and years. And nor is any animal capable of doing the extraordinarily stupid things which our superstitions and prejudices compel us to do. With the language makes possible these two extremes of human behavior. As I say, the angelic, it is possible for a human being to be a saint. It's not possible for an animal to be a saint. It is possible for a human being to be a great scientist. It's impossible for an animal to be one. But it is also possible for a human being to be a Hitler, and it is also possible for a human being to cherish the most grotesque and hideous superstitions and to act upon them in a consistent and grotesque manner. Well, over and above this control of individual behavior, language, of course, is what gives the continuity to any society or culture. Lamarckism, biologically speaking, is untrue. The acquired characteristics are not inherited on the biological level, but they are inherited on the psychosocial level, inasmuch as each generation, thanks to language, can profit by the knowledge and experience accumulated by the previous generation and its ancestors in general, and can stand on the shoulders of its predecessors and go further, so that we have, so to say, invented a new and much more rapid form of evolution by evolving this extraordinary instrument of language. But again, I think we must stress the point that the language can bequeath to us from one generation to another not only valuable information and ethically useful traditions, it can also hand on monstrous superstitions, absurd prejudices, and the most dreadful kind of prejudices in regard to other human beings, so that it is always ambivalent in its workings. In recent years, there has been, of course, a great stress has been laid in modern philosophical writing on the immense importance of symbols. And it's rather interesting to find that in the Oriental tradition, this goes back a long way, this conception of the enormous importance of language. In the Indian tradition, the power which creates the strictly human world, the world in which human beings live, is called nama-rupa, name and form. And this name is, so to say, the subjective aspect of form, and form is the objective, the objectification of name and its projection into the outer world. And name and form together create the human world, the all too human world in which we live, the world of separate objects, the world of the subject-object relationship, the world of things, often quite unrelated to one another. I mean, there's this remarkable fact that we do not, our language doesn't help us by its structure to think of the world as a continuum. We have to think of it in terms of these separate objects, whereas, of course, as we tend to discover as science progresses, the world is a continuum, and it's extremely difficult to think of the world as a continuum in terms of the ordinary language. We have to adopt various kinds of mathematical languages in order to be able to think of the world as a continuum. Now, in the mystical traditions, both of the East and the West, enlightenment or salvation or union with God may be described as a grammar transcending state of mind, where the world is looked at not through the kind of lattice work of the local language and symbol system, but in a direct experience. I shall have more to say about this in a later lecture, but I just want to point out this, that you find this again and again arising, being stressed in the mystical literature, that we have to get beyond the conceptual level in order to arrive at what the Hindus call moksha, at what the Buddhists call nirvana, at what the Christian mystics would call union with God. It is necessary to transcend this human and absolutely essential preoccupation with language. Again, here we have the same sense of the ambivalence of language, that it is absolutely necessary. We would not be human without language. But if we want to go to the limits of the religious experience, we somehow have to get beyond language. Now, let us briefly consider how minds work without language. William James spoke of immediate experience as a blooming, buzzing confusion, and he regarded language as the artificial way in which we imposed some kind of order upon the blooming, buzzing confusion. I think now the contemporary psychologist and neurologist would say that the confusion isn't quite as blooming and buzzing as James supposed, that the nervous system itself does a curious job of selection and abstraction long before language comes into play. And of course, when we look at the lower species of animals, we find the most extraordinary selection and abstraction going on in various species. I mean, actually what any animal is aware of is not the universe as we know it. I mean, it's not aware of the sky, the sea, the wind, the trees. It is just aware of those particular objects which are either edible or dangerous to itself. And it lives in this exceedingly limited world. Its nervous system is so constructed that it just selects out of the infinite number of data in the world those aspects which are biologically valuable to it or biologically perilous. And some of these Umwelts, as von Uexküll called them, of animals, are unutterably strange. It's been established recently, for example, that the world in which the frog lives is profoundly unlike any world of which we are aware. Its eyes are optically, apparently, very, very efficient, but it perceives only that which moves. When things stop moving, it doesn't see them. I mean, they sit on a lily pad and look down into the water, and when the minnow is moving, it sees the minnow. When the minnow stops still, the minnow disappears. And so this must be an extremely odd world, to say the least of it. The difference between our nervous system and that of even quite higher animals below us is that although our nervous system undoubtedly selects and abstracts, it lets in a great deal more than the nervous systems of most animals. And it lets in, as I say, a great profusion of data, and a profusion which I think here James is right, that if we did nothing about it, would certainly seem a confusion. And I think there is some evidence that certain types of mental illness are characterized by an inability on the part of the sick person's nervous system to shut out those aspects of the universe which are unnecessary to him biologically, or which are of no special interest to him as a social being. I mean, apparently there are some unfortunate people in mental hospitals who are bombarded by an incredible number of stimuli of every kind, which produces, needless to say, the most frightful confusion. But even even those whose nervous systems are working well and which cut out a good deal of the external world still let in a lot. And it is here, of course, that language comes in, and that we impose an order by means of language. We abstract and categorize and pigeonhole things in their various categories, and so are able to create this order in which we do our living. Now, we not only have this, I think, this kind of inborn capacity, not merely on the neurological level, but also on the linguistic level, for abstracting and then for turning things into symbols. We also quite clearly enjoy the manipulation of symbols. I mean, we love the symbols, and we like fitting them together into extraordinarily complex patterns and systems, which give us sometimes the reality and sometimes the illusion of understanding what the world is all about. And we do this with a kind of play. It's a kind of art for art's sake. I think if we look at the symbol systems which men of various cultures have produced, we are greatly struck by the fact that many of them quite clearly have absolutely no biological value at all. They are the most elaborate kind of games which we impose, which we play, and which through whose rules we look at the world. And of course, when one examines the history and looks into what has happened in various cultures, we see that these games which we produce, these curious structures, symbolic structures which we build up for fun, may often be not merely not useful to us, but also may be positively harmful. For example, take the case of an extraordinarily intelligent people, the Greeks. In spite of their high rationality and their high development of science, they still believed that astronomy had a kind of special human meaning. And we see as a curious event in history that this belief could be absolutely disastrous. On a certain day, I think it was the 27th of August, 413 BC, there was an eclipse of the moon. Well, at this date, Nicias and the Greek army were besieging Syracuse, and they were thinking of going home because they were obviously not succeeding in their effort. But there was an eclipse of the moon, and as everybody knew, an eclipse of the moon is extremely unlucky, and no one should travel for at least a month after this. Well, Nicias decided to remain for another month, and in the course of that month, his fleet was totally destroyed, and all his army was captured and enslaved. And another disastrous example of what happens when we start playing with our symbol systems and build up these fantastic structures out of them is provided by the Aztecs. The Aztecs also had very curious views about the nature of astronomy. They thought that the sun would get tired and die if he wasn't constantly supplied with food, and that the best food for the sun was human blood and the hearts of victims. And they used to raid their neighbors and carry off huge numbers of prisoners whom they would rip the heart out of on the altars dedicated to the sun. Well, what was the consequence of this? The consequence was that when the tiny band of Spaniards arrived, all the neighbors of the Aztecs joined the Spaniards, and the Aztec regime came to an end very, very rapidly. And we find these, as I say, these extraordinary, playful manipulations of symbols built up into all kinds of mythologies and pseudo-philosophies and pseudo-sciences at all periods in the history of the world, and sometimes they are quite harmless, merely rather absurd, but sometimes they are profoundly harmful, and yet men will go on cherishing them. Such is first of all, the extraordinary psychological inertia of man, that he dislikes changing even that which is obviously extremely inconvenient and harmful. And secondly, he has, of course, there's a kind of vested interest in these things, and he tends to regard them in some way as sacred. And as we see from the case of Socrates and from many of the heretics throughout the ages, that it is extremely dangerous to start questioning the validity of these symbol systems. Now, I would like here to speak briefly about the symbol systems which are rather nearer to us. Let us take the case of the Middle Ages. Why didn't the Middle Ages develop anything resembling modern science? Well, the answer to this is given by the great French historian of medieval art, Émile Malle. What he says is this: in the Middle Ages, the idea of a thing was always more real than the thing itself. The study of things for their own sake held no meaning for thoughtful men. The task for the student of nature was to discover the eternal truth which God meant each thing to express. But when we inquire what was the eternal truth which was supposed to be expressed by each thing, we find, of course, that it was not the laws of nature as we speak of them. It was not the regularities which can be discovered by observation, and also which require for their discovery the sacrifice of many old prejudices and even of common sense, as we're discovering now. Far from that, the eternal truths which were to be discovered in things were notions deduced by logicians from other notions and fantasies which could be found in books which were regarded as authoritative. So that we have, I must confess that when I read the literature of the Middle Ages, I begin by being entertained and amused by this curious anthropomorphic view of the world. But in a very little while, I find myself not merely profoundly bored, but also feeling a sense of terrible oppression. One seems to be shut into a kind of prison. There are no windows in this medieval world. Everything in Gerald Manley Hopkins's words, what is the phrase? What is it? Shares man's smudge and shares man's smell. There is this terrible, all too human quality about the world. Yes, it wears man's smudge and shares man's smell. This I do find extremely depressing in the whole medieval world picture. But it was impossible for human beings, given their symbol system, which they accepted without question, most of them, to get outside this prison. And in a much more recent case, we have a very interesting example of the impossibility of getting beyond a going symbol system. We have a very good example of this in the history of hypnosis, which is a subject I happen to be very much interested in. If you look at the history of hypnosis in the first half of the 19th century, you are astonished to find that extremely intelligent men refused to believe the evidence of their senses. They saw these hypnotic phenomena. I mean, for example, eminent doctors would see a hypnotic operation, an operation being carried out, an amputation being carried out under hypnotic anesthesia, and would say that it wasn't true. I mean, they would say that the man was obviously shamming, just pretending he didn't feel pain in order to annoy the doctors, or that in some way the operator was bamboozling them. I mean, it is absolutely incredible when you read the history of this, and also to read the way in which great pioneers in this field, who demonstrated, for example, that they could reduce the mortality rate from surgery, which was then 29%, to 5% by using hypnotic anesthesia. Men like Esdale were simply hounded out of the medical profession for what they did, instead of being greeted as saviors of society. Not at all. They were attacked because it was impossible for their orthodox colleagues to get outside the prison of the symbol system in which they had been brought up. And much more recently, William James, of course, had the same complaint about his colleagues in regard to a subject in which he was deeply interested, what is now called extrasensory perception. And he says again and again that the evidence, which was considerable then, and which I think is still more considerable now, was simply disregarded because it did not make sense in terms of the Weltanschauung, the symbol system, which was then fashionable. And rather than extend the system so as to embrace the new facts were rejected in order to retain the system. And in this context, I would like to quote a remark which my grandfather, Thomas Henry Huxley, made about Herbert Spencer. He said that Herbert Spencer's idea of a tragedy was a deduction foully murdered by a fact. And now, it's quite obvious that our present symbol systems are a good deal wider and more comprehensive than those, say, which were current in the Middle Ages. But I think undoubtedly historians of the future will look back and note with astonishment the way in which our attachment to our present kind of symbolic picture of the world has blinded us to facts which to them will be completely self-evident. I mean, I don't know what these facts are, but I think we can say without any doubt that 100 or 200 years from now, people will look back and think, well, isn't it incredible that in the middle of the 20th century, when such and such facts were so obvious, staring people in the face, that their attachment to their particular Weltanschauung, their particular symbol system, was so strong that they could not envisage these facts. They could not take them in and incorporate them into the general picture of knowledge. Well, the moral of all this seems to me clear, that we somehow that we have to make the best of both worlds, to make the best of the world of immediate experience, which I haven't been able to discuss at any length today, but which I hope to discuss in a later lecture, the world which we receive in a state of receptivity. Needless to say, no experience is absolutely immediate, because all our experiences are to some extent conditioned by the cultural milieu in which we've grown up, by the symbol system which is imposed upon us by our language. But there are degrees of immediacy. I mean, we can be much more immediate or much less immediate in the way we experience the external world. And as I say, the problem which seems to me to confront us both collectively and individually is how to make the best of these two worlds, to make the best of this fresh world, the world which the newness of the spirit, as St. Paul says, or the life's golden tree, as Goethe says, to make the best of this world of pure receptivity, and also to make the best of the symbolic and, above all, the linguistic world. And our business is, first of all, I think, to find methods for training ourselves in being more aware of internal and external data, and also means for continually refining and improving the symbol system which we use in order to impose sense and meaning upon the world. After all, one of the great intellectual developments of the 20th century has been a development in the field of linguistics. We do know much more about the nature of language and about its limitations and its capacities than was known in the past. And I think it is very important that this knowledge should go down right into the roots of education. I mean, that it's possible to teach some of this knowledge to quite small children and to develop the teaching as the young people grow up, so as to make them more aware of the relationship between the symbolic world in which they have to do their thinking and the world of immediate experience in which they do most of their aesthetic and their spiritual and physiological living. So that, I mean, in fine, we just have to stress once more this fact, which I have spoken about several times, that we are amphibians, and that it is our business to get on, get the maximum out of all the universes to which, owing to our strange amphibious nature, we have access. And this is something I shall go on in developing in the later lectures. As I say, we are multiple amphibians. We are not merely amphibians in relation to immediate experience and to symbols, but we are amphibians in other respects too. And we, as I say, the final moral, as far as I can see, is that we must somehow learn to make the best of all the worlds in which our extraordinarily complex nature predestines us to live. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to see so many people here. Once again, this strange, magical moment when we come together again, or perhaps for the first time. You having come from wherever you came from, me having come from the slopes of the world's largest active volcano, actually, but via Manhattan and Austin last weekend. And the purpose of these things is sort of to check the state of the condensing collective understanding about what is going on in the world, or what might be going on in the world. This, it seems to me, is the subject worth talking about. What is going on? How can you find out what is going on? How do you know when you've found out what's going on? Can one know what is going on? And my involvement with this is no different from your own. a sincere desire to untangle these questions before the yawning grave closes over the enterprise and the entire thing becomes moot. One has, a window of opportunity somewhere between 0 and 100 to solve or understand or penetrate or appreciate or come to terms with the conundrum of being, this amazing circumstance in which we find ourselves, both individually and collectively. Collectively, we find ourselves, somewhere between the slime and the archangels, making our way perilously over the millennia, up the evolutionary ladder toward the Platonic light, or something like that. At least this is the myth of intellectuals of the high-tech industrial democracies evolved over the past 150 years, the triumphant ascent of organic life toward ever greater complexity. Individually, we each find ourselves born into a culture we had no share in designing, but that we will be expected to inhabit, inculcate, and in fact pass on to our own progeny. And so this is our circumstance, I think, individually and collectively. Thrown into being, Heidegger said. We didn't ask for it. Here it is. What are we to make of it? And obviously, if you toured the halls of this exhibition, we are to make much of it and money of it. These two principles seem to emerge. That there is much to be said, many ways to slice the pie, and the market economy is a very fertile domain in which to thrash this all out. You can sell your answers, you can trade your answers, you can upgrade your answers, you can subscribe, serialize, retrofit, export, import, and reinvent answers. Ultimately, I wonder how satisfying all this is. And I'm always amused at my own position in this situation. It's a great paean to the tolerance of the New Age that they keep inviting me back. I'm sort of like the crazy uncle, or, you hope for good behavior, but you understand that it's a gamble. Because I'm very ambiguous about much of the methods and ways by which we do our intellectual business and pursue the matter of community and salvation. The intellectual tension that seems to work its way through this society almost like fat through meat is the tension between scientific reductionism and the deeply felt intuition of most people that there is a spiritual dimension, or a hidden dimension, or a transcendental dimension. And of course, downloaded into language, it becomes easily ridiculed. And downloaded into tasteless language, it should be ridiculed. But so when we try to formulate our spiritual intuitions, they are inevitably, I think, tainted by what we bring to it. And I was struck as I moved through the hall, it was almost like an exhibition of language types as much as an exhibition of products or possibilities. What were being sold were closed systems of jargon, which once opted into tended to produce answers in a short loop of possibilities. all closed systems of thought are like this. And to my mind, at what seems to me very elderly age of 50, and I know to some people in the room it does seem very elderly, and to others I seem a pup. But anyway, from this vantage point, it seems to me that all of these ideologies are cartoon-like. They flatten, they simplify, they betray, they amuse, which is also cartoon-like. And in amusing, I think that this is where their health-fulfilling and salutary worth lies. They are intended to provoke a small smile. That smile will lift you a little further up the ladder, the rungs of the ladder of being. So I thought today what I would talk about is some of the conclusions that I've come to out of a life of psychedelic voyaging, living inside this insanely contradictory society, and going through the standard moves: marriage, divorce, children, career, controversy, allies, enemies, attorneys, counselors, consultants, accountants, so forth and so on, the same world you live in. What have well, the first thing I concluded was to try and flee it, which I did a pretty good job of by going to Hawaii, which, believe me, is a private Idaho. But the conclusions that I've reached are not politically correct anywhere. And so I'm very happy to offend everyone, because that seemed to be what I did best, and there's no sign of mellowing at this point. So the conclusion that I reach vis-a-vis the individual and civilization is this: culture is not our friend. Culture is not your friend. It's not my friend. It's a very uncomfortable set of accommodations that have been hammered out over time for the convenience of institutions. A young man gets his first dose of the news that culture is not his friend when told that he's going to be given an air ticket and some training and sent to an exotic country to kill its inhabitants in the name of some political ideal. You have to be fairly dense not to get the message at that point that culture is not your friend. It is using you for its purposes. You would never dream of doing what it now proposes as the only conceivably right and righteous course of action. Well, that's, a black and white, a stark and enormous example of what I'm talking about. But I think every day, in thousands of ways, we betray our impulses toward wholeness, toward community, toward freedom, toward the spirit by genuflecting to cultural values that are squirrely or toxic or simply wrong-headed or obsolete. Culture is not your friend. It's an illusion. What kind of an illusion is it? And this sort of leads on to the other thing I've come to. It's a childish illusion, is the kind of illusion it is. Recently I had a physical examination with my doctor, and after it was all over, he leaned back in his chair and he said, well, most people your age in the 19th century were dead. Yes, quite true. People live a great deal longer in the 20th century. And consequently, I think part of what drives alienation is it's like culture is like being taken in a crap game. If you play long enough, you will figure out that you're being screwed. And, of course, if you die shortly into the game, it never enters your mind. We are all, some of you may have seen the little saying that hangs behind bars in Minnesota, "We get too soon old and too late smart." Well, some of us are getting smart earlier and earlier. And what is seen through to then is the fact that culture victimizes, ideology victimizes. These things are all con games. Reality, culturally defined reality, is some kind of an intelligence test. And those who are joining are failing the test. This is very clear to me looking at, phenomena like alien abduction and the great enthusiasm for conspiracy theory that now seems to attend so much modern thinking. Again, these are epistemological cartoons where low production values, made acceptable through tolerance of TV, is allowing people to accept material into their own story, which should actually end up on the cutting room floor. Nothing is what it appears to be. Surely you've noticed that. That's A, right? A is nothing is what it appears to be. Well, therefore, complex, difficult, tricky, and mercurial things are even less likely to be what they claim to be than other forms of reality. So, confronted with the endless whispered rumors and doctored photographs and breathless testimony from the denizens of trailer courts and so forth and so on, what is one to make of all that? Well, I think the message is return to basics. The information matrix has become compromised. The data stream is now suspect. Return to first principles. What are first principles? That's what the 20th century is trying to figure out. Yes, what are first principles? I'd like to suggest to you that a place to begin is the body. You have one. It isn't ideologically defined. It can be ideologically defined. In Catholic school, the nuns used to tell us we should dress in darkness so we wouldn't be an occasion of sin to ourselves. That's an example of the body becoming ideologically defined. But it precedes culture. Culture has to deal with the fact that your eyes are on the front of your face and your anal pore is located near your genitals. Culture would probably rather have it some other way. It would be so convenient, but hey, it's a given. I'm so happy our rumps don't swell in estrus the way some of the other primates do. Can you imagine Giorgio Armani trying to create a line of fashion that comes to term with that? But I digress. So the body is a pre-cultural given. And coming with the body is this amazing thing which everyone wants to give away, throw away, get away from, called the felt moment of immediate experience. The felt moment of immediate experience. This is you, now, here, in your body, with the cheeseburger slowly dissolving, the cup of the caffeine, the bladder, all of these things, collisions, concrescences, the crossing of trajectories of mental process, digestive process, metabolism, intent, income, emotional state, the felt presence of immediate experience. lodged in the body-mind system in the moment. That's who you are. That's what they can't take away from you. Whether they drag you away to prison, beat you, drug you, whatever they do to you, you will still have some kind of felt presence of experience until you drift into the darkness of non-entity. So there then, one can begin to build outward from that core and say, aha, so the stuff of understanding is not information passed by culturally validated coding systems among the primates at high chatter rate. In other words, the truth is not in the public space or the historical space. The truth is in the felt space of the body in the moment. Well, so some great religions have gotten this far. And they, whatever they are, and there are many of them, come at last to advocate something called meditation, which has many guises and travels under many names and methods. But what it primarily is attention to attention. And what it primarily reveals in the ordinary metabolism is frankly, bloody little. Good meditators will tell you how incredibly boring it is. And the rhetoric of the religions that have made meditation the centerpiece of their ontology is a rhetoric of nihilism. I mean, this is, I should have said nihilism. Because this is sort of the dirty little secret of Buddhist ontology. It isn't the cheerful new Buddhism being exported from California. It's the old style Nagarjunian Buddhism that says, it is an emptiness within an emptiness, after an emptiness, before an emptiness. This is Nagarjuna on the nature of Bodhi mind. But interestingly, meditation, pursued not for years or lifetimes, but pursued as a cultural project over centuries, leads not to a clarifying of this philosophical emptiness, but to a discovery that the depths of nihilism, the depths of non-entity, are in fact multifarious in their aspects. Not a plenum is what I'm grasping for. Not a plenum, not an undivided Platonic thing, but an environment of spirit, meaning, power, intentionality, entities, intelligences, levels, swarming in the imagination. And these things can be accessed through drugs, through extraordinary physical practices or ordeals, through various kinds of driving of physiological systems like sonic driving, through drumming, or physiological driving through repeated chanting. And then the ordinary boundaries of culture and of body dissolve into a much larger realm, the imagination. And it is this imagination that I think is the place to put our attention. The imagination is a dimension of non-local information. Quantum physics is now moving towards securing the idea that in some kind of a mathematical superspace, all particles in the universe maintain a kind of super state of connectivity called Bell's non-local connectivity. What this means to me is that the imagination is literally another dimension, a dimension that is non-local. Now, the mind, the animal mind, the human mind, the Paleolithic mind, evolved as a master coordinator of sensory data coming into the body from the senses about the level of threat and danger in immediate three-dimensional space. That's the mind's evolutionary function, to preserve the body, to preserve the genetic stream of unfolding by detecting and avoiding threat. And so our minds have evolved in the same way that water takes the shape of its container. Our minds have evolved to take the shape of three-dimensional space and time under cultural and environmental pressure. Well, we've paid a huge price for this. It probably also has ensured that we're here this afternoon to discuss it. But it's been a long time since the instantaneous reflex to bash the brains out of anything moving near you that's unfamiliar has served us well. You know, I mean, that got old 12,000 years ago. The entire enterprise of civilization has been about something else. The felt presence nearby, ineffable, unsayable, but uncannily penetrating of beauty, of mathematical connectivity, of supernatural power. And so these are the things, the exploration of which, the singing about of which, make us human beings. The exploration of the universe of the unseen is the business of human beings. It's why we are the way we are. It's why we will be the way we will be. It's how we got where we are. How is it done? It's done by dissolving ordinary cultural boundaries, by perturbing consciousness, and by paying careful attention to the results and attempting to build models therefrom. Now, in the last few thousand years in the West, this enterprise has been tamed by priestcraft, which combines the enterprise with judicious politicking and a certain amount of ass-licking. Before that, the enterprise was untainted by such secular concerns. It was full force forward into the unknown, and this is the great era of shamanism. And what is shamanism but philosophy with a hands-on attitude? Philosophy not made around the campfire, but philosophy based on the acquisition of extreme experience. That's how you figure out what the world is, not by bicycling around in the burbs, but by forcing extreme experience. The reason people refer to psychedelic endeavors with the vocabulary of travel, taking a trip, and so on, is because that is an extreme endeavor. It's the same endeavor. It's the leaving behind of the values of your own culture. You know, take nothing but a change of clothes, fly to Benares, and take up residence at Dasasamid Ghat among the Charas sadhus, and I guarantee you, whether you resort to psychedelics or not, you will experience boundary dissolution, a reorienting of categories, and a reframing of your perspective on your life and your being. So extreme experience is the necessary key. This is true in all forms of endeavor. I mean, if you want to understand the atom, you have to smash it. You know, sitting around looking at it, it will never yield its secrets. You have to smash that sucker to bits and then collect the pieces and then examine exactly how it all came apart. In the same way, and without, going too far afield for the pun, we must smash ordinary consciousness. Get smashed. And then look at the pieces flying in all directions and say, gee, I didn't know minds could do that. They can't in the workaday rote of, living inside the little boxes of positivism and constipated behaviorism and all the rest of it. So extreme experiences. But, you don't want these experiences to be too extreme, or you will sever the connectivity among the various subsystems, and then we'll have to bury you. And this is always a huge strain on those left behind. So there is a practical element here, which is, okay, so we want to have extreme experiences, but we don't want to have such extreme experiences that we don't live to tell the tale. We want control to some degree over these experiences. Well, this is where the incredible thoroughness of our human ancestors comes to our aid. Throughout time and space on this planet, the tribal societies that preceded us made it their business to discover, catalog, and learn to manipulate plants in the environment as the carriers, as the sources of chemical compounds in the environment, which would work extraordinary transformations on consciousness without physical harm, without physiological damage to the organism. And of all the many techniques, ordeal, abandonment in the wilderness, sexual abstinence, hanging by your pectoral muscles from hooks in the sun for days, all of these sorts of things. Of all of these methods, psychedelic plants and their judicious use is arguably the most effective, the most effective and the least invasive and the most likely to produce negative long-term consequences. Well, this was not news or even controversy anywhere in the world until within the confines of the 20th century, basically, the presence of these substances and plants began to alarm the order-keeping forces of the high-tech industrial democracies. An issue separate from the issue of stimulants and depressants. It's an issue separate from the issue of addiction and dependency. These things are not stimulants or depressants, and they do not cause addiction or dependency. What they cause is what I'm advocating, a fundamental revaluation of cultural values. Because culture, as we're practicing it currently, is causing a lot of pain to a lot of people and animals and ecosystems, none of whom were ever allowed to vote on whether they wanted this process to go in this direction. We do not feel what we are doing. Remember, I spoke about the primacy of the felt moment of experience. If we could feel what we are doing, we would stop doing it. But between us and the consequences of our action, there are endless veils of political rhetoric, stultification, denial, sedation, intoxication, ideological delusion. Now, normally, I think a rap like this tends to, if you have to pigeonhole it, to come down on the side of pessimism. But I am not pessimistic. I see everything as though it were integrated and connected, and there is an unfolding and a plottedness about our situation. It's not for nothing that at the very pinnacle of the age of faith in the machine and science and male dominance and projection of strategic weaponry and so forth and so on, that there should come from the gentler societies of the world, from the rainforests and high deserts of the world, the news of these plants. You know, the Western mind, the cataloging mind, the Cartesian mind, in its frenzy to locate, list, isolate, and define everything, carried these plants and substances over the past 150 years into the confines of our society, and they are much like Trojan horses. left there by the bedraggled, beat-down, disenfranchised, third-world shamanic people, to be found by the white-coated priests and priestesses of science, and to be brought back into the laboratory to be picked apart for their efficacy in treating addiction or overcoming neurotic behavior or something like that. But of course, the neurotic behavior that they impact upon is neurotic behavior so wide, so deep, so revered that it is in fact cultural values themselves. You see, what is happening, I think, is it's really bigger than psychedelics. It's bigger than human evolution. We are not making the waves in this ocean. We are corks riding the waves of the ocean. But we are privileged by perhaps chance alone to occupy a unique moment in the history of the universe. A moment when the universe goes through some kind of self-transforming, evolutionary, inflationary expansion. That's what's happening. I mean, it's been happening for a long time. It depends on where you pull back to get your perspective. One could say, looking at the universe in general, that this planet has been favored from the very beginning. That by 1 billion years ago, the discerning could tell that this was a planet going places. But certainly, by 500 million years ago, it was clear that this was a planet going places. One complex animal life form gave way to another. Catastrophes, yes, but never catastrophes so total that the Enterprise was wiped out. We know that 65 million years ago, a catastrophe, an asteroid, a planetesimal impact occurred on this planet. Nothing larger than a chicken walked away from that on this planet. A bad day, you say. But were it not for that bad day, we would still be the egg-eating shrews at the edge of the reptilian garden party. These marvelous flowering plants chock full of psychedelic alkaloids, none of them would have existed. The flowering plants and the higher mammals all arose in the wake of this planet-scouring catastrophe. So, you see, there is built-in to the larger systems of nature an enormous, what my mentor Eric Jantsch used to call metastability. They are metastable. They are not easily deflected. An event as large as a planetesimal impact basically only resets the evolutionary clock by a few million years, and then in almost overleaping itself to make up for lost time, out of all of that catastrophe come primates. Animals of such complexity and coordinated sensoria that they are wonders to behold, and from them, and quickly, then come abilities never before seen in the world of organic organization. Freely commandable languages, spoken languages, symbolic activity for the first time. Well, at that point, even the academics believe human language is less than 40,000 years old. That means it's as artificial as the dirigible or the hypodermic needle. It's an invention of some sort within the confines of human history, or at the beginning of human history. Recall, in South Africa, we have fire pits and stone tools 2 million years old. Those are not Homo sapien tools, but they're the tools of Homo habilis, the preceder, the preceding ancestor in the human line. My point is, we are caught up in a process of unfolding complexification that has now lodged in our species. We are its source. at this point. At one point, its source was the geology of the planet. At a later point, closer to us in time, its source was all biological diversity. But as the novelty has increased, the domain of its expression has narrowed, and it is now confined largely to the human species. Oh yes, the rest of nature continues the slow unfolding of continental drift and gene mutation and transfer and so forth. But these things have now receded into the background as the human adventure takes center stage. So it's almost as though, in fact, this is what I believe, that we are not pushed from behind by the causal unfolding of historical necessity, but that we are in the grip of an attractor of some sort, which lies ahead of us in time. And so we are not, as it were, following what the statisticians call a random walk across the temporal landscape. In fact, the temporal landscape is a canyon with incredibly steep walls, and we are only free to move within very narrow confines as the grip, almost the morphogenetic intensity of the attractor at the end of time increases its penetration and its hold over our imaginations, our city plans, our technologies, our religious ontologies, our medical strategies, so forth and so on. Something is revealing itself to us, through us. And as we get closer, the chatter of noise and static being given off of this thing increases exponentially because, McLuhan said once, he said, we move into the future like a person driving who uses only the rear view mirror. That's how we understand the future, by driving in the rear view mirror. All of our models of what lies ahead are based on inverted models of the past. And the one thing you can be certain of is that won't do it. Because we can see a person standing in 1900 using that method would have been wrong about the late 1990s. A person standing in 1600 using that method would have been wrong about the late 1900s, and so forth and so on. You cannot extrapolate from the future from the past into the future, because the real nature of the future is its ding en sich, the thing in itself, and that's what it's trying to reveal. And so the whisperings that reach the ears of the channelers, the visions that come through the hands of painters, sculptors, choreographers, musicians, all of the felt presence of the invisible world is now incredibly pregnant with this message of transformation. And the challenge for each of us is to streamline our language sufficiently that we may mirror this thing in a way that is both true to it and rationally apprehendable to ourselves. And this is a fractal boundary. This is a test of intelligence, because the thing in itself cannot be rationally beheld. The enzymologist J.B.S. Haldane once said, the world is not only stranger than we suppose, it's stranger than we can suppose. That to me is a dizzying thought, and obviously true. So what we want is a model true to the stranger than we can suppose, but not so alien that there is no emotional or spiritual support in it for the enterprise of being human. How do we do that? How do we inculcate the unspeakable mystery of the transcendental object at the end of time with the mundane nexus of real occasions that happens to be our own existence? To my mind, the answer is it lies in the ability to assimilate paradox. And that means you have to transcend the idea of a closed logical system. You have to live with the idea that there is no intellectual closure. This is, in fact, the door marked freedom, but you've been taught that it's the door marked madness, to live in the light of paradox. Things cannot be, we are taught, both A and B simultaneously. This is Aristotelian logic. A is A. This is as old as thought in the West, but it has to be overcome. And in the felt presence of the moment of immediate experience, it is overcome. The mystery does not lie far. It lies in the immediate moment, in the act, the fact of being. The only time we really confront this is in the psychedelic experience or other moments of extreme epiphany. The model that I have come to wrap around all of this, because I think it's simple and straightforward and it leaves plenty of room for people to add their own filigree, is a dimensional model. God forbid, a mathematical model. But it works something like this. I mentioned earlier that our senses have evolved as a threat detection device and have sort of crunched us down into three-dimensional space. The shaman, wherever and whenever he or she does their shamanizing, the shaman is a person who is able to transcend the dimensional confines of cultural existence. They know more than the people they serve. The people they serve are like children within the game of culture. Only the shaman knows that culture is a game. Everyone else takes it seriously. That's how he can do his magic. I was recently in Australia, and of course Aboriginal culture and shamanism is a topic of great interest down there. And I learned, maybe some of you already knew this, that the term for shaman among English-speaking Aboriginals, of whom there are many, some who have spoken it for several hundred years, or over 100 years anyway, the term for shaman is simply clever fella. And if someone says, I am a clever fella, they are making a professional claim of great weight. But I love that, because it says it all. You know, a clever fella. When I was in the Amazon in my exploring days, we would go up these rivers to these bare-assed folks and to spend time with them. And the people would want to, touch the outboard motors and look at your camera equipment and the butterfly nets and gather around, open-faced, totally innocent. You could always tell the shaman, because first of all, he usually didn't come out to see who was there, even though no one ever came. Even though these people had visitors once every 6 months, the guy who wouldn't come out of his hut for the only event in 6 months was inevitably the shaman. And when you met him, he wasn't interested in your Velcro or your break-apart, glow-in-the-dark little trinkets or any of the rest of it. He was looking straight at you through the eyes outside of culture, saying, what kind of a person are you? Are you a fool or are you a clever fella? What is your measure? How much of the situation do you understand? How many levels are you simultaneously aware of at this moment? And, looking into the eyes of that sort of person, you either grow or turn away. You have not much choice. So what's happening with the shaman, I think, is he's a hands-on mathematician, a hands-on non-Euclidean geometer. The shaman enters into the quote-unquote chaos of the psychedelic experience and sees that it is not chaos. It is hyperspace. And in it, the adumbrations of the trees of possibility can be followed. One can see who stole the eggs. One can see who cuckolded the chief's nephew. One can see who will die and who will live. one can see how the weather is going to change, and one can know where the game went. And this is not magic, not in that world. It's impossible in three-dimensional space and time. But in fourth-dimensional space and time, it not only is possible, it's inevitable and unavoidable. It's a different kind of way of being with the information. And, I'm sure many of you have your own psychedelic epiphanies that are as gripping and as fascinating as anything that has happened to me. Epiphanies that show that under certain circumstances, the ordinary boundaries of information, space, time, limitation are dissolved. And it may happen only for a moment. It may involve a curing with a laying on of hands. It may involve a sudden insight into a set of complex relationships. It may involve a sudden, unexpected certitude about how a certain event went down that, when checked upon, turns out to be true. What we know about the world is defined by our culture. And the way culture does this is through language. You can't know or perceive or appreciate what cannot be brought in to the domain of language. You can't publicly know or appreciate these things. You can feel them as the rich contextual embeddedness of your own being, but you can't communicate them. Sometimes when I read Marcel Proust, I come upon passages where the conveyance of the information, of the emotion, is so exquisitely subtle that I have the feeling, I know what he means. I felt this, but I never dreamed I would ever see it in print or have a thought about it that I could share with anyone else, because it is so subtle. So the challenge to all of us, I think, is not this one-dimensional chasing after of answers. This is a fool's game, but an actual stepping back to gain perspective and to realize, salvation is always available. It's in the moment. It's an act of understanding. It doesn't come down through a lineage. It doesn't come through a substance, an empowerment, a word. It comes through understanding. Salvation is an act of rational apprehension of some sort. And, I really believe that we are now in a relationship to the transcendental object at the end of time, such that the revelations are daily. The unfoldment, the connectivity, we can see light at the end of the tunnel. I've had long practice at this. I've been thinking like this since 1968, talking about it like this since 1980, but I never knew how it would come or what it would be. In the last few years, with the rise of a technological, a cultural artifact like the Internet, I now see how it will make its way into the world. We are building the nervous system of the human oversoul. We are individual units operating under social rules that are pushing us ever closer toward dissolving our societies, human groups run by rules, into telepathic collectivities of some sort. The chaos of the Internet is chaos only to the constipated order freaks of the Hobbesian sociological machine. It makes them uncomfortable because they can't find the head, they can't find the hierarchy. But it's head and hierarchy that have distorted and made human institutions so abrasive and uncomfortable for the people who inhabit them. So I really believe there is no contradiction between technology and the spirit. There is no contradiction between the search for intellectual integration and understanding and the psychedelic experience. There is no contradiction between ultra-advanced hyperspatial cyberculture and Paleolithic archaic culture. We have come to the end of our sojourn in matter. We have come to the end of our separateness. This is all very scary. None of us know what it means, but the forces that have been called into being are now beyond the control of any institution or any strategic planning committee or any banking committee. These things have a life of their own. There is a morphological unfoldment occurring on this planet. It is bringing forth some entirely new order of being. We are a privileged part of this. Individually, our hope is to understand and participate in the epiphany. There is no blame. Nothing is off-kilter or wrong or unnatural or artificial. No principle has been betrayed. This is how it is supposed to be. But as it picks up speed, it's going to become more and more frightening as most metaphors fail. And this is why the rise of cults, and why the grasping at ontological straws, and why the whisperings from various corners of the universe have grown to a roar, because we are uncertain. We are not sure. But I think you become sure by connecting to the source. And then what you become for other people is a source of reassurance. The perfect metaphor for understanding this situation is a birth. If you had never seen a birth, and you were rushing about your daily business and suddenly came around a corner and this was happening, as, for example, could happen to you in India or in Africa somewhere, and here you confronted human birth, if you had not been prepared for that moment, you would have a real emotional thing on your hands. It looks like a medical emergency. Blood is being shed, organs are being stretched, there's pleading and groaning and moaning. You have to have your chops very together to look at this situation and say, how wonderful, new life, coming into the world as it has always come into the world. Now, a birth can be simple and easy, or it can be prolonged and tormented. It can be an occasion for joy, or it can end in catastrophe. The key is preparation, understanding, awareness, and a desire to meet the experience in all of its fullness. The birth is coming. The birth is coming. And what it does to the social systems we've put in place, the groaning ecologies that are taking the weight of our billions, what it does to the atmosphere, what it does to the economies upon which you and I depend, this all depends on how educated and enlightened each one of us can make ourselves as the thing moves toward completion. And it's no time for foolishness. And it's no time for rumor mongering, and it's no time for throwing away your epistemological razors and indulging in the spreading of unlikelihoods. It's time to actually pull together. The plants are the pipeline into the Gaian intention. It's just not a coincidence that these plants carry this immense spiritual message. They are the pipeline of Gaian intentionality. We were not out of balance. For millions of years, or hundreds of thousands of years of intellectual existence in which we had humor and song and ribaldry and poetry and horsing around and art and theater, we were not out of balance because our religion involved the dissolving of our cultural values once a week or once a month back into the mysterious mama matrix of primordial being. Once we cut that off, once we began to make it up, or to listen to the most shrill among us make it up, we were lost. That's what we're returning to. Our story is the story of the prodigal son. We left the family farm, the balance, the domesticity, and we made a shaman's journey deep into the heart of matter and of energy, of space and time. We return with gifts, with understandings no shaman before ever had. Quantum physics, fractal mathematics, astrophysics, cosmology, the knowledge of DNA. This is real knowledge, and we shed real blood to obtain it. Now it can be given meaning by being brought under the umbrella of authentic, archaic, human values informed by relationships with psychedelic plants. This is the comfortable future, the hopeful future that lies ahead. To the degree that people turn their back on this, they are going to have a rough time explaining to themselves and their children just what exactly is happening at the end of the 20th century. Okay, that's my rant. Now I want to hear from you. Thank you. The issue that hovers around the psychedelic experience, it was mentioned last night, it's strong in my life. I haven't found any real solution other than hold your nose and jump. But the issue is surrender. This is something real. You don't find people going into the ashram in the morning to meditate with their knees knocking in fear because of how terrifying and profound they know that meditation is going to be. But if they were going in there to smoke DMT, they would be fully riveted on the modalities of what was about to happen. I mean, we can tell shit from shinola. It's just that we don't always prefer shinola. And I'm not like, I don't advocate it. People, like sometimes there are people who are disappointed because they say, well, how often do you do it? Well, the answer is not very often. I mean, if I can get it in a couple or 3 times a year, I feel like I'm hitting it pretty hard. And the more successful it is, the less often you have to do it. I mean, I know people who say DMT is their most favorite drug, and when you say, well, when was the last time you did it? They say, well, 1967. It only lasted 4 minutes. They're still processing it. And they are still processing it. They're not just whistling Dixie. I mean, it is, to my mind, just the most... Well, I mentioned this earlier, the question, how do they keep the lid on this stuff? And I suppose here I'm preaching to the converted, because many people last night said they had an interest in this kind of thing. But they don't keep the lid on sexuality. No society has ever had it so under control that people didn't have sex. I mean, they may have had sex under weird conditions and under, ritual strictures and this and that. But we are like this salamander that has the option of never developing into its mature form. And to my mind, that's a tragedy, because this is our birthright, and somehow our inability to get a grip on our global problems has to do with this immaturity about our mental state. The two, I feel very strongly, are linked. And that, of course, we can't get control of the world because we are children in some profound way. And we don't like being children, but the culture has reinforced a form of infantilism. And the way I explain it to myself is it's a kind of unwillingness to go it alone on a certain level. I don't know how many of you remember in Brave New World, Huxley's brilliant dystopia, but there's a scene in there where Bernard, who is the guy who's out of it in the novel because in his fetal fluid they got an alcohol contaminant. And so he's different from everybody else in this society, and he occasionally has original thoughts. And he and his assigned girlfriend for the evening, or whatever she is, are in a helicopter, and they sweep out past the crematoria where they're recollecting elements for reuse. And he suspends the helicopter over the Black Bay, and she immediately becomes very agitated, restless, anxious, and pleads with him to return to the city. And what it is it's her anxiety over being alone in the presence of nature. She literally can't take it. And I think there are a lot of people in our society, and each of us in our own way at different times, who have within us this neurotic and infantile creature that can't face it alone, and that this going it alone thing is very important. You know, Plotinus, the great Neoplatonic philosopher, he spoke of the mystical experience as the flight of the alone to the alone. And in the psychedelic experience, there is this issue of surrender, because a lot of people want to diddle with it. They want to be able to say they did it, but they don't ever want to face an actual moment where they put it all on the line. And yet the whole issue with this stuff is to let it lead, to let it show what it wants to show. So somehow, individually, we have to reclaim our experience. The real message, more important even than the psychedelic experience, the real message that I try to leave with people in these weekends is the primacy of direct experience. That as people, the real universe is, within your reach, always. Everything not within your reach is basically unconfirmed rumor. And we insert ourselves like ants or honeybees into hierarchies of knowledge. So we say, well, what's going on in the world? Well, turn on CNN. And then somehow we're ordered. Then we say, okay, it's 85 degrees in Baghdad and the wind is out of the northeast at 15 miles an hour. And we feel somehow better now because we're getting the information. But what we have done is sold out direct experience. And all institutions require this of us, that we somehow redefine ourselves for the convenience of the institution. And this redefinition always involves a narrowing, a denial, so that, if you want to be in Marxist society, if you want to function in Marxist society, you have to define yourself as a Marxist human being. Well, it turns out in a Marxist society there are no homosexuals because that just happens in decadent societies. So then, if you happen to notice any tendency like this in yourself, you have to deny its existence because this just doesn't happen in a Marxist society. And similarly, every society has this. In our society, if you hear voices, we have mental hospitals for you. If you have vast visions of the future, we have drugs that can help you and make this go away. So we so then somehow in modern society, the discovery of psychedelics is the discovery that all of this cultural machinery is just Wizard of Oz stuff. You remember the scene in The Wizard of Oz where the curtain is swept back and they see the little guy there, and he says, booming out over the loudspeaker, "Ignore the little man pulling the levers. Ignore the little man pulling the levers." Well, the little man pulling the levers is what sweeps into view with psychedelics, and you discover, aha, culture is provisional. You know, whether we have 9 wives or 3, whether we tattoo ourselves blue, whether we eat insects or not, all of these things are just decisions that we make, and then we congratulate ourselves on our wisdom, and we live within that, and we hunt down and kill all the people who disagree with us, and that's called having a culture, having a way of life, being somebody. But with, I don't see history as a wrong turning. I see it, the metaphor that I like is that of the prodigal son, that there was a reason for this long descent into matter, this peregrination. It was a shamanic journey of some sort. The shaman goes into the world pool or ascends the world tree to go to the center of the axis of the cosmos, to recover the pearl or the gift or the lost soul, and then return with it. And this is what history was, I think. It was a descent into the hell worlds of matter, energy, space, and time, for the purpose of recovering something that was lost. It wasn't lost by us. It was lost by the breathing, the disystole of the planet. Just climax of climate moved us into paradise and then moved us out of paradise. I mean, you must that the story of Eden is the story of history's first drug bust. I mean, it's the story of a whole lot of tension over who's going to take or not take a certain plant which confers knowledge. And Yahweh, wandering in the garden, says to himself, if the man and the woman eat of the fruit, they will become as we are. The issue was co-equality, co-knowledge with the Creator. Well, where do we stand, in man's existential march? How does that work? Can we always accept the subservient, infantile position? I mean, is knowledge to be dispensed by gods, and if not gods, then the institutions that appoint themselves as gods over us? Or is it actually that maturity begins with somehow claiming this birthright? And it is a birthright. And I don't know if a society can survive the claiming of this birthright by a large number of people. Certainly in the 1960s, when this was attempted, everybody got very agitated, and then it was frozen out. In so-called primitive or pre-literate societies, there is the office of the shaman, and the shaman is deputized to act for all of us. In the same way that we have airplane mechanics to fix jet engines, we have shamans to explore these hidden and fairly terrifying other dimensions. The people who self-select themselves into a group like this, in a society like that, would be the candidates for this kind of shamanic voyaging.